adaptations. This lecture is really just an introduction and an overview of sort of really the themes and the topics that we'll be covering across this course. For discussion on the assessments or the sort of week by week what we'll be doing, I'll do separate mini lectures for that. So basically what I'll be doing is I'll be recording all of these lectures across the semester and I'll be putting them up. You can find links on Blackboard, so keep checking Blackboard for the links. I'll try and make these as quick as I possibly can, and I'll try and section them off depending on sort of what topic. So rather than include the assessment in this lecture, I'll do another one just for the assessment, just so it's there and easy to find. Okay. So, like I said, just keep checking Blackboard for updates. So everything you need for the course as far as readings goes is on Blackboard. So all of the creative readings and all of the critical readings will be on Blackboard, and they're all sort of hyperlinked and everything like that. The course structure is, so basically we've got a 3-hour slot and we'll be watching films in that slot, and also I'll be just sort of doing a lecture and introducing the films and talking about important information like assessments and things like that. And then we've got a 1-hour tutorial. Ideally, I would have liked 2 hours for the tutorial, but we've only got 1 hour, which is a bit unfortunate. So we'll be kind of having to pack a lot into those tutorials. So please be on time to the tutorial, as it'll be really important because we'll be going across things like the assessment and things like that. As you can see, the sheets are spread across the week. All right, so the screenings and the lecture will be happening on the Mondays, and then the tutes will be happening across the week. Please keep turning up to the tutorials. It's really important, really for your own assessment. Often people who do really well in this subject are the people who do turn up every week. Okay, important matters I think we should start with is we do have a film adaptation Facebook page, and I know that's probably making many of you very excited. You don't have to be part of this group at all. It's just sort of a fun group that I run on Facebook. If you're not on Facebook, it doesn't matter. It's really nothing directly related to the course. It's just maybe a conversation might happen in one of the classes or one of the lectures or something like that. And I'll sort of just put up some links onto the Facebook page. Or if I just sort of hear sort of interesting adaptations that are being made, I might put up a link onto this group. Now, it's not just people involved with the course who are part of this group. It's more of a broader group, and they often put things up as well. Like today, I found out that The Mist will be headed to television, which is all very interesting, I guess. Okay, so the course will explore how historical and classic short works of fiction have been adapted into feature films. Right, so we're not interested in the novel to feature film adaptation, although it's very interesting. It sort of it raises some issues. The problem is if you're doing a course on adaptation, it's very hard to have students read a novel every week just for the course. So often what you end up having is students who just haven't read the novels. So what I've done is I've made it short works being adapted, and I think that's really interesting because what it does is it allows us to discuss how short works are expanded into popular feature film narratives. So I'm not looking at television adaptations in this course. I'm looking at feature film adaptations and the feature narrative and what that actually entails, and how a short work has to be expanded and adapted in a particular way to suit the popular feature film narrative. Now, by limiting the parameters of the source being adapted allows for broader conversations on the industrial and social context for which adaptations are produced and consumed. And I'm really interested in those two elements. How is an adaptation produced and how is an adaptation consumed? Right? So really what I'm doing in this course is I'm looking at what an adaptation is, but what an adaptation does. All right, now it's very easy to sort of say, well, this is what an adaptation is, but what does an adaptation actually do? And how do we read something as adaptation? And why is it important to read something as adaptation? So a lot of those things will be coming into sort of the marketing of these particular films that we're looking at across the course. So the key questions that we'll be looking at in this course are these. Is an adaptation of a short work less serious than a lengthy novel? Right? How do we actually evaluate and respond to a short work of fiction that's being adapted? Are we more inclined to give a sense of prestige to a sort of the classical, 1,000 word book as a 1,000 page book? Sorry, not 1,000 word book. 1,000 page book, is that a more worthy adaptation than, say, a short work of fiction or a graphic novel? Or a poem. We're actually looking at poems in this course. What are the benefits and limitations of adapting a short work of fiction? All right, a lot of adapters will say it's a lot easier to adapt short works of fiction than a novel, because what you're doing with a novel is you're condensing, and what you're doing with a short work is you're basically expanding. Right? How are short work adaptations marketed? This becomes very problematic for certainly publishing houses who are wanting to sell their novels or sell their books on the back of a successful adaptation being done. So the curious case of Benjamin Button, which we're looking at in the course, is a very famous short work by F. Scott Fitzgerald. But how does the company actually manufacture and publish a short work of fiction, which obviously doesn't entail an entire novel? So we'll be looking at that. How do short work adaptations complicate the what's in, what's out approach to adaptation criticism? Often when we're evaluating adaptation, and often when adaptations are being reviewed, what happens is the reviewer or the critical commentator will criticize the adaptation or praise the adaptation for what's being left out of the book or what's being left in the book. All right. With the short work, it doesn't actually have that luxury, because you have to add things. You have to do something with the work, with that sort of the standing text. So I think that's really quite fascinating when we're talking about adaptation and adaptation theory. What are the contextual and cultural issues of updating a classic work for new cinema audiences? And so we're looking at old works in this course and how they're being adapted and updated for new audiences, and that in itself is quite interesting. What sort of narrative conventions does a feature film apply to short works of fiction? Okay, so feature film has a narrative convention that it follows. You can call it 3-act structure. We'll sort of look at those kinds of things across the course. But the short work of fiction, how does that actually apply to the feature conventions? Is there a contrast there? Is there a conflict there? And how do different sorts of adapters overcome these problems? So what we're really interested in is doing is, like I said, is looking at what an adaptation is and what an adaptation does. So we're looking at definition and practice. How do we define an adaptation? And how does an adaptation actually play in practice? How do we produce our own adaptations? We're primarily interested in the process of adaptation. So the questions we're looking at: what does it mean to identify something as adaptation? Does it create unnecessary expectations? Are we harder on an adaptation of a favourite work of ours, right? Or are we less? Are we more critical of adaptations, right, than sort of the non-adaptations? And how does one adapt? How does one actually go about adapting? How do different participants engage with adaptation at different levels? Right. So in this course, all of the examples or case studies are reflexive. And what I mean by that is all of the films that we're watching, the film itself is self-aware of its own adaptation. It understands that it is adapting a classic or a known work. So they don't pretend that the adaptation doesn't exist, right? Like a lot of works do. And in the first week of the course, which is adaptation, that's certainly a film that's sort of in conversation with itself about adaptation. So adaptation is not one-way traffic. It's not specifically the adapter talking to the adapter. Adaptation is not a single, fixed, recognizable story that is being adapted. What happens with adaptation is it's an ongoing, it's unstable, and it's an open-ended multi-text. So what's happening with the source is it's saying adapt me. It's asking to be adapted, but it's asking to be adapted in particular ways. So when a work is adapted, that's not the end of the conversation, right? That's only the beginning of the conversation. And what you actually see is films will be adapted over and over and over again. And there's always this sort of, people grumbling about why is this being adapted again when it was adapted only a few years ago. But it kind of goes against the point of the source text being an unstable and open-ended multi-text. So where do we draw a line at what we call an adaptation? right? What is it that's actually being adapted? So when something's being adapted, what actually is being adapted, right? And what's really interesting is when you take words from a piece of paper and you put them into moving pictures, what are you actually adapting, right? Are you adapting the style, the mood, the techniques of the writing? What are you actually adapting? Or are you just adapting the story and the plot and the characters, right? So there's different forms of adaptation that we're looking at. So this course is also interested in the industrial nature of adaptation, how adaptation is a marketing strategy. So in marketing terms, franchise storytelling, like the comic book franchise. In the interest of industry, adaptation needs to keep finding audiences in different media, genres, and demographics, right? And I think that's really interesting, how adaptation needs to keep finding audiences. And what adaptation does, is it reminds you of the earlier work, and it encourages to actually go back and read the earlier work or engage with the earlier work in some profound way. And how does one market a short story? And I think that's again really interesting, and a real interest of the course. So an important, adaptations exist laterally, not vertically. And what I mean by that is adaptation, it's plural, it's not singular. So we're talking about the adaptation package. So we're looking at a work and all the different things and all the different ways that that work is being adapted. So what we're giving you in this course is maybe one example of an adaptation, but there are many examples of adaptation. If you look at the Curious Case of Benjamin Button, I mean, there's been numerous different sorts of adaptations of that work, graphic novels, songs, poems, all different sorts of things. And I think that becomes really interesting in the way that an adaptation is actually adapted in so many variable ways. So we don't consider adaptation in this course as photocopies of the original. And what I mean by that is a photocopy, if you photocopy something, what you're getting is kind of the same work, but the version isn't quite as good. The pages are a bit faded. It's just not quite as sharp as the original was. And that's often how adaptations are considered. I don't consider it like that. What I consider adaptation, there's no sort of superior work in the adaptation package, right? There's only a new second, right? So there's new seconds. And what I mean by that is to be second is not to be secondary or inferior. What the new seconds is to say there is something that came before it, but this isn't just a second of the original. This is a new second, and it's sort of a new way of thinking about the original, right? Or to be first is not to be original or authoritative, right? So the original doesn't mean it's the best work of that, and you actually get a lot of examples where, like The Godfather, for instance, where the film is clearly a better work than what was actually going on with Puzo's prose. So again, it's not thinking of the original as being more superior in any way. Now, the critical abuse of adaptation and misunderstanding is a central interest of this course. And why are we so harsh on adaptations and so kind of cruel to adaptations? Now, refusing to accept the original superior idea allows us to explore the three central ways we engage with stories. So we're interested in the telling of the story, the showing of the story, and in the interacting of the story, and how we interact with both pieces of paper, stories being told through pieces of paper, and stories being told through sights and sounds, moving pictures. An adaptation's telling, showing, interacting is not inferior, right? So an adaptation is not inferior. The three modes of engagement provides the structure of this course. So what we're looking at in this course is the what, why, who, how, when, and where of adaptation, right? How do we make sense of adaptation? What context do we place it? How do we evaluate, not value, all adaptations? What happens when adaptations go wrong and why? And I think that's a really important thing. What happens when adaptations go wrong and why? Why don't many adaptations work? And how do we actually judge an adaptation? Like, is a good cinematic adaptation just a good film? Or does it actually have to be doing something directly with the source that it's adapting? And we'll be looking at that question quite intensely across the course. So what the course is not about, it's not a series of extended case studies of specific adaptations. I mean, it is, but it's not actually, we're not sort of privileging the case study method and saying, okay, this week we're only talking about this film and that film alone. Well, what each film is doing, or what each adaptation is doing, is giving us a case study of a broader way of adapting. And each week we're looking at a different way of adapting. Now, the films and the readings are there to demonstrate broader ideas and definitions and modes of adaptations, and I think that's really important to sort of understanding the whole course, right? So if you miss one week, you're kind of missing out another way of adapting, and each week becomes very crucial to the assessments, which I'll talk about in another lecture. Not all examination of uh, they're not all examination of just cinema adaptations, right? So the interest is the process of adaptation, not a particular media, right? So the assessment is not specific to any particular media. You are free to take adaptation where you like. So say you're a lit studies student and you're not really interested in film adaptations, but you're interested in other forms of adaptation. You're welcome to sort of pursue those avenues in your own assessments. Now, we're interested in how different types of media changes elements, including point of view, time, irony, exposition. All right, what happens to things like the point of view from, say, one text being adapted into another? All right, and how does that differ in different medias that we're talking about? An ongoing question is the difference between a story being told as opposed to a story being shown, and I'm really interested in that, how that actually changes. Um, how adaptations encourage audience interaction and participation. And that's the thing about adaptation, it's all about fan participation, not just interaction. So social media has profoundly changed adaptation and how we actually interact and discuss adaptations in a public forum. An interest is to explore how different audiences engage with different medias and the challenges that changing medias hold. And again, that's really important in this course. So, audience, fans, and copywriters, we will be looking at copyright and the process of copyright and actually just what's going on, like who owns adaptation, who produces an adaptation. So adaptation in this course is understood as a process of creation as much as a product of reception, right? So we're involved with adaptation as consumers. I'm really interested in our own responses to adaptation, how we consume adaptation, what we do with adaptation. Some people just against adaptation. You don't like the idea of adaptation because does it lessen the originality of of what's being adapted? Now, I just want to finish with this